The heiress, already preparing to leave, turned, irritated by the intrusion, but before she could react, the bull, now with an imposing stance, advanced. It wasn't a wild attack, but a living barrier, a wall of flesh and contained fury. It cornered her against the very cliffside, the smell of earth and wild animal filling the air. Fear, a feeling she rarely experienced, chilled her spine. There, between the bull's silent rage and the abyss, the selfish heiress confronted the destiny she herself had invoked. Her mother, now in the shadow, felt a faint relief as justice, with horns and hooves, began to be served. The air, previously laden only with the sweet scent of dry grass and the heiress's expensive perfume, now pulsed with a new raw fragrance, that of the bull. Earth, animal sweat, and an ancestral fury that seemed to emanate from every fiber of its massive body. The heiress, whose name was synonymous with power and disdain, felt the animal's warm breath on her face, the metallic tang of her own fear rising in her throat. It was a smell she never imagined she'd encounter, a fear she never thought would reach her. Her eyes, accustomed to sweeping across luxurious ballrooms and disdaining the less fortunate, were now fixed on the bull's dark, deep eyes. There was no malice there, no calculated cruelty she knew so well in the human world, but an unwavering determination, a force of nature that could not be bribed or intimidated. The tips of its horns, polished by time and countless challenges, looked like sharp blades. Dangerously close to her chest, she could feel the heat radiating from the animal's body, the vibration of its tense muscles, the silent promise of a strength that surpassed her in every way. The cliffside, once just a detail in the landscape she intended to leave behind, was now a cold, rough wall against her back. Each breath of the bull, a deep, rhythmic sound, seemed to push her a little closer to the edge of the abyss. She was trapped. The woman who controlled empires, who dictated destinies, who saw the world as a stage for her own convenience, was now at the mercy of an animal and gravity. The ground beneath her feet seemed to give way, not from the earth's weakness, but from the vertigo that overwhelmed her. The voice she used to give orders, to humiliate, to demand, was now trapped in her throat. A scream tried to escape, but was choked by a knot of panic. She tried to move, a primal instinct to flee, but the bull, without a single abrupt movement, merely adjusted its stance, closing off any sliver of hope. It was a macabre dance, where she was the sole prisoner and the bull, the silent jailer. Back in the benevolent shadow of the tree, her mother watched. Her eyes, previously clouded with pain and despair, now held a complex mix of shock, apprehension, and, yes, a pang of dark satisfaction. She saw her daughter, so haughty and untouchable, reduced to a trembling figure, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. The justice her mother had silently begged the heavens for seemed to have taken form in hooves and horns. A faint, almost imperceptible relief coursed through her paralyzed body, mingled with the maternal concern that, however wounded, still persisted. She didn't wish for her daughter's death, but she wished for her to feel, to understand. The heiress, in her desperation, tried a tactic. "Get out." "Stupid animal, get out of my way," she hissed, her voice hoarse, almost inaudible. But the bull remained impassive, its muscles rippling beneath its thick hide. It wasn't a dog to be scolded, nor an employee to be fired. It was a guardian, a primordial force that had risen to correct an imbalance. Time seemed to stretch, each second an eternity of terror. The heiress could feel the cold wind rising from the abyss, a constant reminder of the imminent fall. She looked down at the rocky, green expanse stretching hundreds of feet below, and a chill ran down her spine. It was the same vastness she had envisioned for her mother, a place of oblivion and insignificance. The irony was a bitter poison in her mouth. The bull took a minimal, almost imperceptible step, but enough for the heiress to feel the cliffside crumble slightly beneath her heel. A small pebble rolled, disappearing into the void with a distant sound. Panic exploded within her. She wasn't just trapped, she was in mortal danger. The animal didn't need to attack her, it only needed to keep her there on the edge until fear itself or the instability of the ground did the job. Her eyes flew to her mother, seeking help, a remnant of compassion. But her mother was motionless, her eyes fixed on the scene, an unreadable expression on her face. The heiress realized there was no rescue. There were no employees, no security guards, no driver to take her away. There was only her, the bull, and the abyss. The sun, which had previously tormented her mother, now seemed to mock her, warming the rock at her back, reminding her of the cruelty she herself had inflicted. Destiny, with horns and hooves, seemed in no hurry. It merely waited. The bull's silence was more terrifying than any roar. It didn't attack, didn't snort in explicit fury. It merely existed, a living wall of flesh and purpose. Its eyes, once just dark, now seemed like mirrors of eternity itself, reflecting the vastness of the sky and the abyss below. Yet without any trace of emotion Isadora could decipher. There was no anger, only an unwavering vigilance. It was as if time had stopped, and the only reality was the animal's warm breath on her face and the biting cold of the cliffside against her back. Isadora, the woman who dictated orders to hundreds, who moved mountains of money with a wave of her hand, felt childishly small and insignificant. Her words, once so powerful, were now mere hoarse whispers, swallowed by the wind whistling at the edge of the precipice. She tried again, her voice a nearly inaudible thread. "Please, leave. I'll give you anything you want. Money, an entire farm. Just let me go." The bull didn't move. Its muscles, tense and defined, were a living canvas of brute strength. It didn't understand money or farms. It understood injustice, danger, the need for protection. It was a primal guardian, awakened by an act of cruelty that echoed in nature's deepest instincts. The tips of its horns, once just a distant threat, now seemed to draw closer, millimeter by millimeter with each deep breath of the animal. Isadora could feel the pressure in the air, the imminent danger. The panic she had kept under control with the force of her will began to disintegrate. Her mind, accustomed to calculating risks and manipulating outcomes, was short-circuiting. There was no solution, no escape. Her desperate eyes swept the landscape in search of any intervention, but there was no one. The vastness of the field, the relentless blue sky, the overwhelming solitude. Only her, the bull and her mother, a silent, motionless witness. Back under the tree's shadow, Helena watched. The pain in her paralyzed body was a constant, but now a new sensation mingled with it. That of slow, inexorable justice. She saw the terror in her daughter's eyes, the same terror Isadora had inflicted upon her day after day with her disdain and neglect. There was no joy in seeing her daughter suffer, not a pure joy. It was a complex mixture of hurt, of a strange satisfaction at seeing the scales balance, and yes, still a remnant of that maternal love that, however wounded, could not be completely extinguished. She didn't want Isadora to die, but she wanted her to live, to feel, to understand. A small tremor ran through Isadora's body. The already unstable cliffside gave way a little more beneath her left foot. A cloud of dust and small pebbles rolled into the abyss, the sound of their fall echoing for a long time before fading into the void. Isadora's heart pounded, beating like a wild drum in her chest. She was literally on the brink of her own ruin. The bull, as if sensing the change in the terrain, took a minimal step to the side, but enough for its massive body to block any attempt Isadora made to move right or left. She was completely immobilized, trapped between the rock and the animal, between life and death. The sun, which had once seemed an accomplice to her cruelty, was now an inquisitor. Its hot rays burned her skin, reminding her of the thirst her mother must have been feeling, of the agony she had inflicted. The irony was a bitter poison, corroding her soul. She, who had always controlled everything, was now at the mercy of forces she could neither comprehend nor master. "Mother!" Isadora managed to cry out, her voice almost a lament. "Mother, help me, please!" Helena didn't move. Her eyes, fixed on the scene, showed neither anger nor forgiveness, only deep observation. She had cried out for help many times, in her silence, in her pain, and no one had answered. Now it was Isadora's turn. The bull, in turn, seemed to understand the desperate plea. Its head moved slightly, an almost imperceptible movement, but one that brought one of its horns even closer to Isadora's face. She could feel the air shift, the imminent danger. The smell of earth and animal sweat intensified, filling her lungs with a fragrance of savagery and destiny. Time continued to stretch, each second a torture. Isadora closed her eyes for an instant, seeking refuge in the darkness, but the image of the abyss and the bull's eyes was seared into her mind. She had never felt so much fear, so much helplessness. All her life, she had built an empire of control, of power, of disdain for those she considered weak. Now she was the weak one, the helpless one, on the edge of a precipice, confronted by a force that could neither be bought nor intimidated. The bull, the old rodeo bull, was the judge, the executioner, and the guardian, all in one. It waited, and Isadora, for the first time in her life, didn't know what to do but wait too, on the brink of her own private hell. The wait was a torment more cruel than any physical attack. Every fiber of Isadora's body screamed for action, for escape, but there was nowhere to go. The cliffside, once an insignificant barrier to her plans, was now a precipice embracing her in a deadly hold. She felt the coldness of the rock against her back, contrasting with the scorching heat of the sun on her skin and the bull's warm breath on her face. The smell of earth, sweat, and a metallic hint of danger filled her nostrils, suffocating any remnant of fresh air. Her eyes, previously closed in a vain attempt to escape reality, opened again, fixing on the bull's dark eyes. There was no hatred there, no uncontrolled fury, only an ancestral vigilance, a patience that seemed as old as the mountains themselves. It was nature's indifference, the brute and impartial force she had always believed she could subjugate with money and influence. But there, on the edge of the abyss, her empire of power was useless. She was just flesh and bone, as vulnerable as any creature on the face of the earth. An uncontrollable tremor started in her legs and climbed up her spine. The ground beneath her feet, already precarious, seemed to vibrate with the frantic beating of her own heart. She could feel the sand and small loose stones slipping beneath the soles of her expensive shoes, each minimal movement threatening to unbalance her. The bull, sensing the instability, made no sudden move. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, an almost imperceptible gesture, but one that brought the tip of one of its horns even closer to her shoulder. It wasn't an attack, but a warning, a constant reminder of the thin line separating her from the fall. The panic she had kept under control with the force of her will began to disintegrate. Her mind, accustomed to calculating risks and manipulating outcomes, was short-circuiting. There was no solution. No escape. Her desperate eyes swept the landscape in search of any intervention, but there was no one. The vastness of the field, the relentless blue sky, the overwhelming solitude, only her, the bull, and her mother, a silent, motionless witness. Back there, Helena watched. The tree's shadow was a refuge, but it didn't alleviate the chronic pain that accompanied her. Her eyes, however, were fixed on her daughter, and in them the complexity of emotions deepened. She saw the terror, yes, but she also saw the arrogance unraveling, the mask of control shattering. It was a disturbing sight, but also, in a strange way, cathartic. For years, she had been the silent victim, the forgotten shadow. Now, the universe seemed to have sent a messenger to speak for her. Helena felt no pure joy in her daughter's suffering. Maternal love, however torn, was still a dying ember in her heart. But there was a certainty, a conviction that Isadora needed to feel, needed to understand life's fragility, the pain of helplessness. She needed to be stripped of her armor of privilege to perhaps, just perhaps, find a fragment of humanity. Isadora, in her desperation, tried to speak again, but her vocal cords seemed to have constricted. A hoarse sound, almost a moan, escaped her cracked lips. The thirst she had ignored in her mother now tormented her. Her mouth was dry, her throat scratchy. The sun, which had once been her ally in her act of cruelty, was now an implacable enemy, draining her strength, reminding her of the water she had spilled on the ground. The bull, as if responding to her moan of despair, let out a low snort, a sound not of anger but of deep, ancient wisdom. It was a sound that seemed to say, "You cannot escape this. You must face what you have done." The warm air from its nostrils brushed Isadora's face, and she felt the strong, earthy scent of the animal, a constant reminder of its imposing presence. Time continued to drag, each second an eternity of uncertainty. Isadora felt the weight of the world on her shoulders, gravity pulling her towards the abyss. She looked down again, at the green and rocky vastness that stretched infinitely. The trees below seemed tiny, the streams mere silver threads. It was the landscape of death, of insignificance, the fate she had planned for her own mother. The irony was a bitter poison, corroding her from within. She had built a life of absolute control, of manipulation, of belief in her own invincibility. And now she was trapped, helpless, at the mercy of a bull and the instability of a cliffside. Luxury, power, fortune, none of it mattered here. Life was reduced to a primal instinct for survival, a desperate struggle against fear and gravity. A new tremor, stronger than the previous ones, ran through the cliffside. A larger portion of earth and stones broke loose beneath Isadora's right foot, falling with a more audible, prolonged sound before disappearing into the void. Isadora's heart leapt to her throat. She was slipping. The end seemed imminent. The bull, instead of retreating, took a minimal step forward, further closing the space between them. It wasn't an attack, but a maneuver to keep Isadora trapped, to ensure she couldn't move, neither forward, backward, nor sideways. The tip of its horn now lightly touched Isadora's silk blouse, a subtle but undeniable pressure. It was a physical reminder that it was there, and that she was not in control. Her desperate eyes turned to her mother. "Mother," she managed to whisper, her voice almost inaudible, a thread of sound that the wind nearly carried away. "Please, help me. I don't want to." The sentence dissolved into a sob. It was the first time in years Isadora had asked for help. The first time her voice carried such raw, unprotected vulnerability. Helena, however, remained motionless. Her eyes, though fixed on her daughter, showed none of the compassion Isadora expected. There was a deep sadness, yes, a pain at seeing her own flesh and blood suffer. But there was also a resolution, an understanding that this was a moment of reckoning, a judgment nature had imposed. She had cried rivers of tears, had silently begged for a miracle, and now the miracle had arrived, in the form of an old, wise bull. The bull, in turn, seemed to absorb Isadora's despair. Its dark eyes didn't waver. It didn't move, didn't snort again. It simply existed, a wall of flesh and purpose, a silent guardian waiting for the lesson to be learned. The sun continued to punish, the wind to whistle, and the abyss to call. Isadora was alone, confronted with the truth of her actions. on the brink of her own annihilation, with no one to save her except perhaps herself. But she still didn't know how. The thin thread that bound Isadora to reality broke with every grain of sand that slipped beneath her feet. The cliffside, once an indifferent landscape, was now a hungry monster, devouring the earth beneath her, centimeter by centimeter. The new tremor, more intense, was not just from the ground, but from her own body, convulsing in a panic she never knew existed. She felt the rough rock scratch her skin through her silk blouse, the tip of the bull's horn pressing her shoulder, a living anchor that held her captive, but also prevented her from falling outright. The fall of earth and stones, more audible and prolonged, reverberated in her ears like the sound of her own sentence. She was slipping. The abyss, once a distant blur, now seemed to open beneath her, a cold, dark invitation to oblivion. Her wide eyes fixed on the bull's eyes, searching for any sign, any hint of intention, but finding only the same ancestral vigilance, the same unwavering patience. It was as if the animal were the mountain itself, ancient and unmoving, observing the insignificance of a human being in her despair. The phrase, "I don't want to," echoed in her mind, a pathetic lament. Didn't want what? To fall, to die, or didn't want to be the person who had brought her to this point? The question hung in the air, as heavy as the scorching sun on her neck. Thirst was an ember in her throat, a cruel reminder of the water she had spilled on the ground, of the thirst her mother had endured in silence for so long. The irony was a bitter poison, corroding her from within, making her feel the pain of guilt, an emotion she thought she had eradicated from her soul. Back there Helena watched, the tree's shadow offering physical relief, but none for the soul. She saw her daughter disintegrate, the mask of invincibility shattering into 1,000 pieces. There was no joy in her heart, only a deep and complex pain. It was the pain of a mother seeing her daughter suffer, but also the pain of a woman who had been abandoned, humiliated, forgotten. She had cried out for help many times, in her silence, in her pain, and no one had answered. Now it was Isadora's turn, and the universe, in its relentless wisdom, had sent a messenger to speak for her. She had built a life of absolute control, of manipulation, of belief in her own invincibility. And now she was trapped, helpless, at the mercy of a bull and the instability of a cliffside. Luxury, power, fortune, none of it mattered here. Life was reduced to a primal instinct for survival, a desperate struggle against fear and gravity. The smell of earth, wet with the bull's sweat, mingled with the dust of the cliffside, invaded her nostrils, suffocating her. Every beat of her heart seemed to echo in the depths of the abyss. She could feel the sand and small loose stones slipping beneath the soles of her expensive shoes, each minimal movement threatening to unbalance her. The panic, which had once been a knot in her throat, now exploded in her chest, a wave of adrenaline that left her dizzy. She tried to breathe deeply, but her lungs seemed to refuse to obey. Her mother's voice, echoing in her mind, seemed to mock her. "You always think you're above everything, Isadora." And now she was literally above everything, but on the verge of falling into nothingness. The tip of the bull's horn, once just a threat, now seemed to pulse with the animal's contained strength. It was not an act of aggression, but of containment, of imprisonment. Isadora felt the heat of the bull's body, its heavy, rhythmic breathing that seemed to synchronize with the frantic beating of her own heart. She was in a perfect trap, created by her own actions, executed by a force she could never have foreseen. The control she so cherished had unraveled, revealing the fragile illusion that was her life. The sunlight, once an accomplice to her cruelty, was now an implacable inquisitor, burning her skin, reminding her of the thirst her mother must have been feeling, of the agony she had inflicted. The weight was a torment more cruel than any physical attack. Every fiber of Isadora's body screamed for action, for escape, but there was nowhere to go. The cliffside, once an insignificant barrier to her plans, was now a precipice embracing her in a deadly hold. She felt the coldness of the rock against her back, contrasting with the scorching heat of the sun on her skin and the bull's warm breath on her face. The smell of earth, sweat, and a metallic hint of danger filled her nostrils, suffocating any remnant of fresh air. Her eyes, previously closed in a vain attempt to escape reality, opened again, fixing on the bull's dark eyes. There was no hatred there, no uncontrolled fury, only an ancestral vigilance, a patience that seemed as old as the mountains themselves. It was nature's indifference, the brute and impartial force she had always believed she could subjugate with money and influence. But there, on the edge of the abyss, her empire of power was useless. She was just flesh and bone, as vulnerable as any creature on the face of the earth. An uncontrollable tremor started in her legs and climbed up her spine. The ground beneath her feet, already precarious, seemed to vibrate with the frantic beating of her own heart. She could feel the sand and small loose stones slipping beneath the soles of her expensive shoes, each minimal movement threatening to unbalance her. The bull, sensing the instability, made no sudden move. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, an almost imperceptible gesture, but one that brought the tip of one of its horns even closer to her shoulder. It wasn't an attack, but a warning, a constant reminder of the thin line separating her from the fall. The panic, which had once been a knot in her throat, now exploded in her chest, a wave of adrenaline that left her dizzy. She tried to breathe deeply, but her lungs seemed to refuse to obey. Her mother's voice, echoing in her mind, seemed to mock her. "You always think you're above everything, Isadora." And now she was literally above everything, but on the verge of falling into nothingness. Isadora let out another moan, more like a wounded animal's sound than a human's. The bull's horn grazed her skin, a chilling warning. She could feel the fabric of her blouse torn, her skin exposed to the sharp tip. The void beneath her seemed to pull her, a promise of oblivion, a quick and brutal end. And she thought with icy terror that this was the same end she had wished for the woman who now watched her with an almost frightening serenity. The thin air of the precipice seemed to steal her voice, but she continued to plead, to cry, to apologize in a frenzy of despair that consumed her entirely. The weight of her actions, once so easy to ignore, was now an overwhelming burden, pushing her to the edge of the abyss. The cliffside, once an insignificant barrier to her plans, was now a precipice embracing her in a deadly hold. Isadora felt the coldness of the rock against her back, contrasting with the scorching heat of the sun on her skin and the bull's warm breath on her face. The smell of earth, sweat, and a metallic hint of danger filled her nostrils, suffocating any remnant of fresh air. Her eyes, previously closed in a vain attempt to escape reality, opened again, fixing on the bull's dark eyes. There was no hatred there, no uncontrolled fury, only an ancestral vigilance, a patience that seemed as old as the mountains themselves. It was nature's indifference, the brute and impartial force she had always believed she could subjugate with money and influence. But there, on the edge of the abyss, her empire of power was useless. She was just flesh and bone, as vulnerable as any creature on the face of the earth. There in the shadow, Helena watched her daughter crumble. The serenity on her face was a thin mask, behind which a storm of emotions raged. Every moan from Isadora was a knife, every tear a reminder of what they had lost. Maternal love, though wounded, was not dead. It bled, but it still existed. She saw the child Isadora, the girl who once called her mother, with adoration in her eyes, superimposed on the cruel woman who had abandoned her. It was a harrowing sight, but along with the pain came conviction. The conviction that Isadora needed to feel, needed to understand, The bull, with its imposing stillness, was an impartial judge, a mirror reflecting Isadora's own cruelty back to her. It wasn't revenge, Helena repeated to herself. It was a lesson, a chance, perhaps the last, for Isadora to find a fragment of her lost humanity. She pressed her lips together, her hand trembling slightly on the blanket covering her. The sun, which had once tormented her, was now a mere observer, and the gentle breeze in the tree's shadow was a cruel contrast to her daughter's personal hell. Isadora, her body trembling uncontrollably, felt the bull's horn move again. Not a push, but an adjustment, a slight slide that sent more earth and stones tumbling into the abyss. The sound of the detachment, dry and final, echoed in the valley, a somber premonition. She closed her eyes tightly, the image of the void swirling in her mind. No, please no. The cry was a hoarse whisper, almost inaudible. She no longer knew what she was asking for, only that the end not come. The memory of her mother sitting in the wheelchair under the sun, her mouth dry, her eyes begging for a drop of water, invaded her mind with brutal clarity. The sneering smile she had given, the perverse satisfaction at seeing the water trickle onto the dry earth. Now, her own throat was on fire, her tongue swollen. Thirst was a physical torment, but guilt, a torment of the soul, was infinitely worse. She deserved this, she thought, with a pang of self-awareness that shocked her. She deserved to feel every agony she had inflicted. The bull, as if reading her thoughts, let out a low snort, a deep sound that vibrated through her body. Its dark eyes, deep and ancient, seemed to penetrate her soul, stripping her of all her defenses. She was no longer the powerful heiress, the woman who controlled destinies. She was just a tiny creature at the mercy of a greater force, of a justice that could neither be bought nor manipulated. Helena, from her vantage point, saw the moment something broke in Isadora. Not just her pride, but something deeper. The mask of indifference completely shattered, revealing a raw vulnerability, a primordial fear she never thought she'd see in her daughter. A solitary tear rolled down Helena's aged face. It wasn't a tear of joy or revenge, but of an ancient pain, mixed with a faint, almost imperceptible spark of hope. The lesson was brutal, yes, but perhaps it was working. Perhaps, just perhaps, Isadora was finally seeing the world through different eyes, eyes not blinded by selfishness. The bull's horn moved again, this time a little further to the side, exposing Isadora to an even more precarious section of the cliffside. The earth beneath her right foot began to give way more sharply, a small slide of rocks and dust that plunged into the void. Isadora let out a sharp cry, a sound that tore through the silence of the gorge. She clung desperately to the rock, her nails bleeding, but there was nowhere to get a firm grip. Her feet were slipping, and the fall seemed imminent. The bull, however, did not push her. It merely held her there, suspended between terror and inevitability, a silent witness to her own ruin. Isadora's life, once so full of certainties, now hung by a thread as fragile as the spiderweb swaying on the rock above her head. And, for the first time in a long time, she had no control whatsoever. Isadora's life, once so full of certainties, now hung by a thread, as fragile as the spiderweb swaying on the rock above her head. And, for the first time in a long time, she had no control whatsoever. The sharp cry that tore through the silence of the gorge still echoed in her ears, a sound that seemed to come from someone else, but was undeniably hers. Her fingers, once so delicate and accustomed to touching silk and jewels, were now raw, scratching the rough rock in a desperate attempt to find any kind of support. Every small protrusion, every tiny crevice was a vain promise of salvation, crumbling under the pressure of her broken nails. Her right foot, which had given way, now dangled in the air, a dead weight pulling her further into the abyss. She could feel the icy wind rising from the valley floor, a frigid breath that seemed to kiss the sole of her expensive, now useless shoe. The smell of damp earth and ancient stones mingled with her own cold sweat, a cocktail of despair that suffocated her senses. Her wide eyes tried in vain to focus on something, anything, other than the dizzying void below. But the world spun, and the only constant was the coldness of the rock against her back and the menacing heat of the bull in front of her. The bull, with its imposing stillness, was a monolith of flesh and bone, a mountain of muscle that held her captive. Its eyes, once merely vigilant, now seemed to carry the weight of centuries, the silent wisdom of the earth. There was no fury in its gaze, only an unwavering determination, a primordial force that could not be argued with, bought, or bribed. Isadora felt the horn graze her shoulder again, not as a push, but as an anchor, holding her suspended in that limbo of terror. It was a wordless punishment, a judgment without a judge, just nature's relentless scales. Her mother's voice, which had once been a mockery in her mind, was now a lament, a plea for forgiveness she had never given. The image of Helena under the scorching sun, her mouth dry and cracked, her eyes imploring for a drop of water, was a cruel mirror of her own agony. Her throat was on fire, her tongue felt like sandpaper. Thirst, which had once been a mere annoyance, was now an excruciating torture. A constant reminder of her own cruelty. She had laughed, had reveled in her mother's misery, and now the irony was a bitter poison in her mouth. There in the shadow, Helena watched the scene with an intensity that exhausted her. Every movement of Isadora, every tremor, every moan was a pang in her own heart. The spark of hope that had emerged earlier now fought against the overwhelming pain of seeing her daughter so close to the limit. She wanted to scream, wanted the bull to move away, but her vocal cords seemed trapped, her voice stolen by the same helplessness that had paralyzed her under the sun. The lesson was brutal, yes, but the line between lesson and tragedy was thin, dangerously thin. A warm tear rolled down Helena's face, not of revenge, but of a wounded love that still refused to die. She saw the child Isadora, the girl who once called her mother, with adoration in her eyes, superimposed on the cruel woman who had abandoned her. It was a harrowing sight, but along with the pain came conviction. The conviction that Isadora needed to feel, needed to understand. The bull, with its imposing stillness, was an impartial judge, a mirror reflecting Isadora's own cruelty back to her. It wasn't revenge, Helena repeated to herself. It was a lesson, a chance, perhaps the last, for Isadora to find a fragment of her lost humanity. The panic, which had once been a wave, was now a tsunami, sweeping away any trace of reason. Isadora felt the ground beneath her left foot also begin to give way, a slow and inexorable sensation of disintegration. Small stones rolled, and the sound of them hitting the bottom of the abyss seconds later was a hammer pounding in her chest. She was slipping, not all at once, but at an agonizing pace, each centimeter an eternity of terror. Her muscles screamed in protest, but there was not enough strength to resist gravity. The smell of her own fear was palpable, mixed with the bull's warm breath, which now felt like a furnace. Her eyes fixed on her mother's, there in the shadow. Helena, her face marked by pain and age, but with a strength Isadora had never understood, seemed like a statue. There was no joy in her gaze, only a deep sadness and an unwavering vigilance. Isadora tried to speak, but her voice was just a hiss, a scratchy sound that couldn't form words. She wanted to beg, not for her life, but for forgiveness. She wanted to undo every act of cruelty, every acidic word, every moment of indifference, but it was too late. The past was an abyss as deep as the one opening beneath her feet. The bull, sensing the imminent fall, let out a low grunt, a sound that vibrated through Isadora's body, but it did not retreat. It merely maintained its position, a relentless guardian of that brutal lesson. The horn, once just a threat, was now a constant point of contact, a firm pressure that prevented her from falling backward, but did not save her from slipping downward. She was trapped, suspended between the rock and the animal, between life and death, between the past and an uncertain future that seemed to close rapidly. The rock, once a symbol of her strength and unshakability, was now the very instrument of her ruin. She felt a warm tear roll down her face, mixing with the dust and sweat. It was not a tear of anger, but of despair, of regret, of a late and painful understanding. She was falling, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The rock, once a symbol of her strength and unshakability, was now the very instrument of her ruin. She felt a warm tear roll down her face, mixing with the dust and sweat. It was not a tear of anger, but of despair, of regret, of a late and painful understanding. She was falling, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The ground beneath her feet, or what was left of it, completely disintegrated. It wasn't a slow slide this time, but an abrupt fall, a violent tug of gravity that made her lose the last trace of contact with the cliff face. The scream that escaped her lips was no longer a hoarse whisper, but a primal sound, pure terror, that mingled with the whistling wind and the roar of the stones accompanying her descent. For an instant, the bull's horn, which had held her captive, seemed to pull away, and she felt the complete void beneath her back, the icy air of the abyss kissing every inch of her exposed skin. The world spun in a dizzying blur. The blue sky, the rough rock, the imposing bull, and her mother's face in the shadow, all mingled in a chaotic dance of colors and shapes. Isadora's life flashed before her eyes, not in flashes of glory and wealth, but in moments of cruelty and selfishness. She saw Helena's face, young and smiling, holding her in her arms, and then the same face aged and marked by pain, begging for a drop of water. Each memory was a stab, each act of malice another stone in her chest, pulling her down. "Forgive me!" The word tore through her throat, a last and desperate plea, not to the world, but to herself, to the mother she had betrayed. It was a silent promise, an oath made to the void. If there was a chance, a single chance for redemption, she would seize it with all her might. She would give everything, relinquish everything, just to undo the pain she had caused. Wealth, status, power, all seemed insignificant in the face of imminent death and the overwhelming weight of regret. Up above, in the shadow, Helena let out a muffled scream. Her eyes, previously fixed in stoic vigilance, were now wide with pure terror. Maternal love, which had been repressed by the need for Isadora to face the consequences, exploded with overwhelming force. She tried to move in her wheelchair, to reach out, to do anything, but her paralyzed body was a cruel prison. Warm, abundant tears streamed down her face, no longer from pain or resentment, but from a visceral fear of losing her daughter, no matter how cruel she had been. The lesson had been learned, she thought, at a terrible cost. There was no longer any need for punishment, but the bull, with its ancestral wisdom, seemed to have a different plan. At the exact moment Isadora felt completely lost, that the fall was inevitable, the animal's horn moved. Not to push her, but to fit strangely and firmly beneath her armpit, pinning her against the rock. It wasn't a complete rescue, but a brutal interruption of the fall. She was no longer falling freely, but suspended, her body swaying precariously, half in the abyss, half caught on the bull's flank. The pain was excruciating. The horn sank into her flesh, tearing the fabric of her expensive blouse and piercing her skin. A cry of pain mixed with relief escaped her lips. She was wounded, terribly wounded, but she wasn't falling. Her feet still dangled in the void. The sensation of vertigo still overwhelmed her, but there was a point of contact, a force that kept her from plunging. The bull held her there in a limbo of agony and survival, neither fully saving her nor letting her fall. Her eyes opened, fixing on the bull's dark eye, mere inches from her face. There was no anger, no triumph, only an imposing stillness, an unwavering determination. It was as if the animal was saying, "You're not done yet. The lesson isn't over." The bull's warm, heavy breath on her face was a constant reminder of her vulnerability, of her insignificance before nature. Isadora felt the strength of her arms completely fail. Her hands slipped from the rock, hanging inertly by her side. She was completely at the mercy of the bull, suspended only by the horn that pierced her flesh. The physical pain was intense, but the pain of the soul, the regret, the shame, were even more overwhelming. She had been broken, not just physically, but in her pride, in her arrogance. Helena, seeing the scene, felt a mix of relief and dread. Isadora was wounded, but alive. The bull hadn't killed her, but held her in a position that resembled a modern crucifixion. The lesson continued, and Helena knew that what came next would be as important as what had already happened. Her eyes, now tear-filled, watched every movement, every tremor of her daughter. Hope, fragile and painful, still persisted. Perhaps, just perhaps, Isadora could emerge from this ordeal as a different person. The cold wind of the gorge continued to whip Isadora, but now she felt the warmth of the bull's body against hers, a paradox of threat and sustenance. The smell of earth, sweat, and blood was the new reality. She was no longer the powerful heiress, the woman who controlled destinies. She was just a tiny creature at the mercy of a greater force, of a justice that could neither be bought nor manipulated, and for the first time in her life, she was truly defenseless, completely dependent on something she couldn't control. The silence of the gorge was broken only by her own groan of pain and the bull's occasional snort, a constant reminder of her new and terrible reality. Time, once an impetuous current Isadora manipulated at will, now dragged, dense and viscous, each second an eternity of pain and revelation. The bull's horn, a bony and relentless extension of nature, pierced her flesh, a point of concentrated agony under her armpit that radiated through her arm and chest. Warm blood flowed, mixing with the cold sweat of terror, and the metallic scent filled her nostrils, a vivid reminder of her own vulnerability. Her feet, once firm on the ground, now dangled in the void, swaying in a slow and macabre rhythm, each movement a reminder of the imminent fall that the bull, for some unfathomable reason, still prevented. The abyss below was a hungry mouth, dark and silent, waiting. She could feel the icy wind rising from the depths, a cold breath that contrasted with the bull's heavy animal warmth against her back. The animal didn't move. It just held her there, suspended, a statue of suffering and regret. Her eyes, once full of anger and defiance, were now fixed on the bull's dark, deep eye, mere inches from hers. There was no malice there, no fury, only an ancient stillness, a millennial wisdom that seemed to see through her soul, stripping her of all her defenses. The physical pain was excruciating, but the pain of the soul was even more overwhelming. In her mind, a whirlwind of images unfolded, not the scenes of luxury and power that once defined her, but the moments of her cruelty. She saw Helena's face, not just the current one, marked by illness and pain, but the face of her young mother, radiant, holding her with unconditional love. She saw herself, a spoiled child, then a rebellious teenager, and finally, the cold, calculating woman who spilled her mother's water on the ground, an act of inhumanity that now seemed a heinous crime. Each memory was a thorn, every harsh word she had uttered, a blow to her own chest. Mother! The hoarse whisper barely escaped her lips, mixing with a groan of pain. It wasn't a plea for help, but a lament, a request for forgiveness she knew might never be granted. Arrogance, pride, indifference, everything had been pulverized by gravity and the bull's horn. She was broken, not just in her body, but in her essence. The powerful heiress, the woman who controlled destinies, was now an insignificant creature, at the mercy of a greater force, of a justice that could neither be bought nor manipulated. There in the shadow, Helena watched, every fiber of her being twisted in a mix of terror and a strange, painful hope. Tears streamed freely down her face, but they weren't just tears of fear. They were tears of a mother seeing her daughter in agony, but also tears of a woman seeing the truth finally revealing itself. She wanted to scream, wanted to beg the bull to release her, to spare her daughter, but her voice was trapped in her throat and her body, an inert prison. She knew with a cold and terrible certainty that the lesson was not yet over. The bull had not killed her, but held her in a suspended purgatory, forcing her to confront each of her demons. The sun, which had once tormented Helena, now began to move, casting longer shadows across the gorge. A thin, golden ray of light struck Isadora's face, highlighting the sweat, blood, and tears. She felt exhaustion take over her muscles, which no longer responded. Her arms hung inert, her hands open, unable to grasp anything. The only thing keeping her alive was the bull's horn, a painful and ironic connection to life. The bull, in turn, let out a low snort, a sound that vibrated through Isadora's body, not as a threat, but as a deep breath, a pause before a new act. Its eyes, still fixed on hers, seemed to communicate a silent message. You still haven't understood everything. Redemption isn't just about regret, but about action. The pressure of the horn neither lessened nor increased. It was an unbearable constancy, a reminder that she was trapped, suspended between life and death, between the past and a future that seemed to demand total sacrifice. Isadora closed her eyes for an instant, the world spinning in a red and black blur. When she opened them again, her vision was focused on Helena, her mother sitting in the wheelchair, fragile, but with a silent strength Isadora had never perceived. Maternal love, which she had rejected and trampled for so long, was now the only thing that mattered. Wealth, power, status, all seemed an empty illusion in the face of imminent death and the depth of the love she had denied. She wanted nothing more, only the chance to undo the wrong, to truly ask for forgiveness, to be worthy of the love her mother still, somehow, harbored for her. The silence of the gorge was broken only by her own groan of pain and the bull's occasional snort, a constant reminder of her new and terrible reality, and that the lesson, indeed, had not yet reached its end. Isadora's voice, once a hoarse whisper, now rose a little louder, torn by pain, but laden with brutal sincerity. "Mother, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry, for everything." The words were a thin thread, almost inaudible against the wind, but to Helena they resonated like thunder. It was the first time in years Isadora had expressed any form of regret, and the intensity of the emotion that accompanied it was undeniable. Her eyes, once so cold and calculating, were now flooded with tears, reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. I was a monster. I treated you like dirt, and you always loved me, always." The bull, with its imposing stillness, seemed to absorb every word, every fragment of pain and regret. Its dark eyes didn't waver, keeping Isadora trapped in its gaze, as if searching for something deeper, something beyond words. The pressure of the horn in her armpit remained constant, a cruel reminder that verbal forgiveness, by itself, was not the end of the ordeal. The lesson, as the bull seemed to indicate, required a complete transformation, an action that transcended mere lament. Helena, paralyzed in her chair, felt a knot tighten in her throat. Tears streamed freely, no longer just from fear, but from a complex mixture of pain, relief, and an almost unbearable hope. To see Isadora so broken, so vulnerable, was excruciating, but the sincerity in her voice, the truth in her eyes, was what she had waited for so long. It was the daughter she knew, the child she loved, emerging from the ruins of the selfish woman she had become. I would give anything to go back," Isadora continued, her voice failing. "To give you water, to hug you, to be the daughter you deserved." Her eyes fixed on Helena's, a silent, desperate plea. "Please, Mother, please forgive me. I'm not asking to be saved. I'm just asking for a chance to be different, to love you as you deserve to be loved." At that instant, the bull let out a stronger snort, a sound that reverberated through the gorge, making Isadora tremble. Her eyes widened, fixing again on the animal. It wasn't a snort of anger, but of expectation, as if Isadora's declaration, though profound, was still not enough. As if the action the bull demanded was something more, something she hadn't yet understood. The pain in her body was almost unbearable, but the pain of the soul, the need to prove her redemption, was even greater. She was willing to die there, suspended in the abyss, if it meant her mother would forgive her, if she could somehow undo the harm she had caused. The sun was almost setting, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple, and the air grew colder. The shadow of the bull and Isadora, hanging precariously, stretched over the abyss, a dramatic silhouette of an implacable judgment. Isadora felt the strength drain completely from her arms, her fingers grazing the rock, but incapable of any grip. She was completely at the mercy of the bull, and the lesson she knew had not yet reached its final point. What more did the animal want from her? What final sacrifice did she need to make for the scales of justice to balance? The fear of falling was constant, but now, mingled with it, there was a strange acceptance, a willingness to face whatever came, as long as her soul could find peace. The thin thread of Isadora's voice, torn by pain and regret, echoed through the gorge. But the bull's response was a snort, a sound that vibrated in her bones, not of anger, but of relentless expectation. The pressure of the horn beneath her armpit did not lessen, and her feet continued to dangle in the void, each movement a cruel reminder of her precarious existence. The sun, now almost a spectre on the horizon, painted the sky with shades of orange and purple, and the air, which had once been an oven, began to bite with a cutting cold. The shadow of the bull and Isadora, a dramatic silhouette of judgment, stretched over the abyss, swallowing the remaining light. Isadora felt the strength drain completely from her arms. Her fingers grazed the cold rock, but were incapable of any grip, useless. She was completely at the mercy of the bull, and the lesson she knew had not yet reached its final point. The physical pain was a thick veil over her consciousness, but the clarity of her mind, now stripped of all pride, was frightening. What more did the animal want from her? What final sacrifice did she need to make for the scales of justice to balance? The fear of falling was constant, a cold dread in the pit of her stomach that mingled with the icy wind rising from the depths. But strangely, there was now an acceptance, a willingness to face whatever came, as long as her soul could find peace, as long as her mother could forgive her. Her eyes, clouded with tears and exhaustion, turned to Helena. Her mother, sitting in the wheelchair, seemed even more fragile in the dying light, a figure of silent suffering. Helena's face was marked by tears, but there was something more there, a dignity Isadora had never noticed, a resilient strength that she, in her selfish blindness, had ignored her entire life. The image of her mother, thirsty, abandoned under the relentless sun, burned in her mind, more painful than the horn that pierced her. "Water," Isadora whispered, her voice almost inaudible, not to herself, but like a prayer. "I took your water, Mother. I left you. I left you to die of thirst." Guilt was a poison running in her veins, more potent than the blood flowing from her wound. She closed her eyes, and in the darkness of her mind, she saw the water bottle falling, the precious liquid spreading on the dry earth, an act of cruelty that now seemed the worst of sins. The bull, with its unwavering gaze, seemed to observe this internal torture. Its dark eyes were wells of ancestral wisdom, and Isadora felt that it was not just seeing her past actions, but reading the depths of her soul, seeking the true seed of change. The previous snort, she realized, was not a demand for more words, but for a deeper understanding, for an action that transcended the physical. The action the bull demanded was not something she could do with her hands, trapped as she was. It was an action of the soul, a fundamental choice. Amidst her agony, a slow and painful epiphany began to form. The bull had saved her, pushing her mother into the shade. It had ensured that Helena would not die of thirst, even if Isadora had tried the opposite. The bull was there to protect life, to restore the balance Isadora had broken. Her own life, her own suffering, suddenly seemed insignificant before her mother's need. If she could, at that instant, trade places with Helena, give her water, comfort, safety, she would do it without hesitation. It was no longer about her forgiveness, nor about her salvation. It was about her mother's salvation, the reparation of the harm she had caused. "Mother," Isadora managed to say, her voice stronger now, though still choked with pain, I would give my life for you to have your water, for you to be safe, for you to feel no more pain." Hot tears streamed down her face, washing away the dirt and blood, revealing a purity that had been buried by years of selfishness. "I don't deserve to be saved, but you deserve everything. Please, Mother, be well, be safe." It was a total surrender, a complete relinquishment of herself. Not a bargain, not a plea for mercy for herself, but a desperate supplication for her mother's well-being, even if it meant her own annihilation. Wealth, power, life itself, all became irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was the love she had denied, and the chance, even in her last moments, to honor it. The bull let out a different, softer snort, a sound Isadora felt vibrate in her chest, not as a threat, but as a deep breath, as if a millennial tension had finally dissipated. Its dark eyes, once so fixed and demanding, seemed to soften a little, and Isadora had the strange sensation that the animal had understood her. The lesson, perhaps, was finally complete. The night's cold deepened, and the wind howled in the gorge, but Isadora felt a strange warmth spread through her chest, a warmth that didn't come from the setting sun, but from a newfound peace. She had surrendered. She had understood. She had, finally, loved. What would happen next, she didn't know. But she was ready. The bull, the abyss, death, nothing frightened her anymore, for her soul, finally, had found redemption in an act of unconditional love. The bull's snort, now softer, reverberated not just through the gorge, but through Isadora's newfound soul. It wasn't a sound of liberation, but of deep acceptance, as if the scales of justice had finally found their balance. The pressure of the horn beneath her armpit remained, a constant reminder of her vulnerability, but the terror that had once paralyzed her had been replaced by a strange serenity. She had surrendered, and in that surrender she found a peace that money and power could never buy. The bull, with an almost ceremonial slowness, began to move. Not backward, not sideways, but downward. Its powerful muscles contracted, and Isadora felt the horn slide, not to release her into the abyss, but to readjust her position. It was a calculated, precise movement that made her gasp with renewed pain, but also with a hope she barely dared to nurture. The animal was using its colossal strength not to punish, but to save. Still suspended, her feet dangling in the void, Isadora felt the bull's body draw even closer, its warm, hairy flank brushing her back. The horn, once a weapon of judgment, now seemed a point of support, a fulcrum. With a monumental effort, the bull began to lift its head, and with it, Isadora. It was a slow, agonizing hoist, each centimeter a torture for her already lacerated shoulder and armpit. Blood flowed, warm and sticky, but the physical pain was subdued by the vertigo of the ascent and the incredulity of what was happening. Helena, in her chair, watched the scene with wide eyes, her trembling hands covering her mouth in a mix of horror and fascination. She saw her daughter's suffering, but also the divine intervention, the redemption in motion. Tears streamed freely, no longer from despair, but from overwhelming relief, a silent prayer of gratitude forming on her parched lips. With each centimeter she rose. Isadora felt the cold rock of the cliffside scratch her back, her knees, her thighs. She was being pushed upward to the safety of the plateau. The bull didn't let go, didn't let her fall. It guided her, supported her, with a patience and strength that defied all logic. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, her feet touched the irregular edge of the plateau. It wasn't firm ground, but it was earth, it was safety. The bull, with a last gentle but firm push, deposited her there, lying prone, exhausted, bleeding, but alive. The horn withdrew from her armpit, and Isadora felt the cold night air bite the exposed wound. She rolled onto her side, gasping, and her eyes fixed on the bull. It stood there, imposing, its dark eyes still fixed on her, but now without the relentless intensity of before. There was something different in them, a stillness, a mission accomplished. The pain was excruciating, but Isadora barely felt it. Her mind was flooded with a torrent of emotions: gratitude, shame, love. She had been saved, not by her own strength, but by the mercy of a creature she had underestimated, that had judged her and finally had redeemed her. "Mother!" Isadora managed to whisper, her voice hoarse but full of a new urgency. She tried to get up, but her body wouldn't respond. The wound in her armpit burned, and every muscle protested. But her eyes met Helena's, and the distance between them seemed unbearable. The bull then let out a final snort, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of centuries of wisdom. It turned slowly, without haste, and began to walk away from the gorge, towards the darkness of the night that swallowed the landscape. There was no goodbye, no looking back, only the certainty that its task was complete. It had been the herald of justice, the catalyst for redemption, and now its role was finished. Isadora watched its majestic silhouette disappear into the gloom, feeling a strange emptiness, but also a profound reverence. She had survived, but she was not the same woman. The selfish heiress had died in the abyss, and a new Isadora, broken and humble, but full of love and regret, had been reborn on the plateau. Still lying down, Isadora dragged herself a few centimeters towards her mother. "Mother!" she repeated, tears streaming again. But now they were tears of relief and of a love she finally allowed herself to feel. "Forgive me. Please, forgive me." Helena, with an effort that seemed superhuman for her fragile body, managed to extend one hand. Her fingers, thin and wrinkled, touched Isadora's dirty, bloodied face. The touch was soft, hesitant, but laden with all the love and forgiveness a mother can give. "My daughter," Helena whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "My daughter." In that instant, under the starry sky that was beginning to reveal itself, with the cold wind of the gorge howling around them, Isadora knew that the real journey was just beginning. The physical pain was a constant reminder of what had happened, but the pain of the soul had been healed. She had a second chance, an unexpected gift, and she knew she would dedicate the rest of her life to deserving it. Water, the water she had thrown away, now seemed a symbol of everything that needed to be restored, everything that needed to be watered and nourished again. And she would do it, no matter the cost. Helena's touch on Isadora's face was the purest balm her torn soul could receive. There was no condemnation, only a love that had withstood the cruelest of trials. Words of forgiveness didn't need to be spoken. They were in every fiber of that touch, in the tear that streamed from Helena's eye and mingled with the dirt and blood on her daughter's face. Isadora, with a groan that was half pain, half relief, managed to drag herself a little closer, nesting her head in her mother's lap, a gesture she hadn't made since childhood, a return to the only safe harbor she had rejected for so long. The night's cold intensified, and the cutting wind seemed to whisper the harsh truths of the gorge. The wound in Isadora's armpit pulsed with excruciating pain, but she barely registered it. Her mind was focused on her mother's weak breath, the tremor of her hands, the fragility of her body. Water, the water she had wasted with such cruelty, was now an obsession, a thirst that went beyond the physical. It was the thirst to restore, to nourish, to give life. "We need to get out of here, Mother," Isadora whispered, her voice still hoarse, but with a new urgency. She tried to get up, but her body protested violently. A sharp pang made her fall to her knees, the rocky ground scraping her legs. The weakness was overwhelming, blood flowing, but the image of the bull, that wise and relentless gaze, propelled her. It had saved her, not for her to die there, but for her to live, to make amends. Helena, her voice a thread, tried to speak. "My daughter, you are wounded. It doesn't matter." Isadora interrupted her, determination hardening her features. "You matter. We will make it." The task seemed impossible. They were trapped on the plateau, Helena's wheelchair immobile, Isadora wounded and weak. Darkness swallowed the landscape, and the howling wind was their only companion. But the old Isadora, the one who would have succumbed to despair or selfishness, had died. The woman lying there, bleeding and exhausted, was a newborn warrior, driven by a love she had finally allowed to blossom. With a Herculean effort, Isadora managed to drag herself to the wheelchair. The sight of the empty bottle, still lying near where the water had been spilled, was a punch to the gut. But instead of despair, she felt a wave of resolution. She needed water for her mother. She needed help. "I'm going to get help, Mother," she said, her voice firm, though fear clenched her chest. The idea of leaving Helena alone, even for an instant, was agonizing, a dark echo of her original sin. But she knew it was the only way. "I'll be back, I promise." Helena, with tear-filled eyes, simply nodded, a silent trust that Isadora felt as both a burden and a blessing. It was forgiveness in its purest form, a mother's faith in her daughter even after everything. Isadora began to crawl, each movement an agony, each centimeter a victory. She dragged herself away from the gorge into the darkness that seemed infinite. The wound in her armpit burned, her muscles trembled, but she kept going. She thought of each step as a drop of water, an effort to water the life she had dried up. The landscape was treacherous, full of loose stones and thorny bushes that tore at her already wounded skin. The fear of not finding her way, of not getting help, was a constant shadow. But the image of the bull, that silent guardian, and her mother's touch of forgiveness were her beacon. Hours dragged on, or perhaps it was minutes. Isadora didn't know. Consciousness came and went. Pain was a thick veil. Finally, when exhaustion threatened to consume her completely, she saw a faint light on the horizon. A farm, perhaps, or an isolated house. Hope, fragile as a flickering flame, rekindled in her chest. She didn't know how, but she knew she had to continue. For Helena, for herself, for the chance to water what had been destroyed. The journey back with help took an eternity. The paramedics, the farmers Isadora had managed to alert with her last remnants of strength, looked at the scene with a mix of shock and disbelief. Helena was carefully rescued, her fragile body wrapped in blankets. Isadora was taken to the ambulance, the wound in her armpit finally treated, her body exhausted, but her soul strangely at peace. At the hospital, while doctors tended to her wounds and Helena, Isadora couldn't stop thinking about the bull. It had disappeared into the night, a mysterious apparition, an angel of justice and redemption. No one would believe her story, perhaps, but she didn't need them to. She knew the truth. The days that followed were of physical recovery and an even deeper emotional healing. Isadora was no longer the selfish heiress. Money, power, everything seemed empty now. Her priority was Helena, the care, the attention, the love she had denied for so long. She sold the mansion, divested herself of many of her assets, using the money to ensure the best treatment and comfort for her mother, and to invest in causes that helped the most vulnerable. Water, the symbol of her sin and her redemption, became a central part of her new life. She became involved in water conservation projects in underserved communities, seeking, in every drop saved, in every restored source, a way to honor the lesson she had learned in the gorge. The scar in her armpit was a constant reminder of that day, of the bull's horn, of the edge of the abyss, but it was not a scar of shame but of rebirth. She had been broken, humiliated, pushed to the limits of existence, and from there, amidst the dust and blood, a new Isadora had emerged. An Isadora who knew the value of life, the power of forgiveness, and the beauty of unconditional love. The journey was long, the reconstruction arduous, but she was ready. She would do it, no matter the cost.